And how much longer do you expect the excavations to take, Professor Frankston? I smiled modestly, knowing my rivals back on campus would be swearing at the television screen. Oh, it's really very difficult to say. Each time we've opened a new trench, we've discovered another development which is older than the last. It's truly the gift that keeps on giving. I cringed at the words. Why had I said that? The reporter smiled dutifully. But if you had to put a number to it, Professor? At least another few weeks. Absolute tosh, of course. I'd spend the rest of my career excavating this site, so long as I kept playing the delicate game of appeasing the government and not totally alienating the faculty back in England, all the while maintaining enough public interest to keep the funding coming in. I watched as the cameraman panned his device over the 24 dusty holes in the ground that my students and volunteers had painstakingly uncovered. Well, what an exciting development here in Anatolia. Professor Frankston is clearly the 21st century's answer to Indiana Jones. Maybe we should find him a whip and a hat to wear. I beamed at the joke, the only option she'd given me with the cameras rolling back to the studio in London. Christ, but Spielberg had a lot to answer for. If I'd had a quid for every indie joke in the 30 years I've been pursuing archaeology. Cut, the director called, and the reporter handed back her mic and immediately began staring at her iPhone screen. I raised an eyebrow, waiting until she remembered there wasn't a signal for about 40 miles. She grimaced, then remembered I was there. Oh, well done. Didn't embarrass you too much? She flushed slightly, aware perhaps she'd been rude before the cameras started rolling, and hastened to cover the moment. Can you show me anything valuable? I fought the urge to roll my eyes at her. It wasn't her fault that she'd been shipped all the way out here to cover the dig site she'd never heard of. In terms of silver and gold, no. As far as we can see, this civilization never worked on fine jewellery, but the technology required to build such a site. She'd already lost interest. I could hardly blame her, but still, she waved the cameraman forward, and he dutifully shot the length of the giant pillars thrust deep into the earth. How far down do they go? We haven't fully excavated them yet, but our ground-penetrating radar suggests another 10 metres. Is there something below them that we can't see? But she'd already lost interest, giving the ornately carved pillars a careless glance, heedless of the thousands of painstaking man-hours it would have taken to decorate the stone, not to mention the sheer impossibility of its existence. 15 metres of perfectly cut stone, 2/3 of its length shoved underground where no one could see it. What was the point of it all? What had it meant to the builders, and what should it mean to us now? She was talking to Chad. Of course she was. All the female volunteers wanted to dig with Chad. The lad was almost as exquisite as the pillars himself, his natural good looks heightened by the deep tan from hours working in the sun. It helped that he'd ripped the sleeves from his red check shirt too. I suspected that was what had drawn the reporter, like a moth to a candle flame. I rolled my eyes as Chad stood, offering a dirty hand to shake. Why does so much of it go underground? To my surprise, it was the director speaking. He was young too, clearly out of his depth being on the ground, but I'd been impressed by his calmness in the face of the overbearing reporter, who clearly thought of herself as the talent in the small crew. We don't know until we dig it out. Isn't that the priority? The words came out with a sting, and he flushed. Sorry, I didn't mean to be rude. I smiled to cover the moment and held my hand to her. No offence. I'm Josh, by the way. Carl. Yes, in answer to your question, the pillars are the priority, but in archaeology we have to take things layer by layer, literally. I turned and pointed to the dozen or so trenches. These are exploring the layer we're currently standing in. Once that's been cleared, we can excavate another stage. Carl frowned. That'll take more than 6 months, surely? I made a show of looking surreptitiously left and right, before leaning closer and dropping an obvious wink. Carl grinned. I expect this dig site will be my wife and children, and I'll be here for the rest of my career. Or at least the weather's good. Huh! Yes, perks of the job, I suppose. Carl was leaning closer to examine the carved figures on the pillar. Animals? I felt that flutter of mixed excitement and anxiety that always came when I thought about the images. I nodded, moving to stand beside him. That one's a wolf? Dog? We think a dog because it stood next to the man. Ah, so it's domesticated. Or maybe that's a wolf and this is depicting the domestication process, like how they became dogs. It's as good a theory as any. Giraffe. Were there giraffes here? We've never found any bones. I was deliberately being brief, letting the younger man explore the mystery. Strange. Maybe the builders travelled a lot. They were hunter-gatherers, as far as we can tell. Carl shot me a grin. And therein lies the mystery, huh? Seeing my surprise, he laughed. I thought at least one of us should do some background reading on what we were being sent to report on, and she wasn't going to. We both looked over to where his reporter colleague was laughing prettily at Chad, twirling a strand of hair around her fingers. I actually read your book on the Fertile Crescent. Well, I listened to the audiobook. I was surprised. Wow, thank you for that. You're one of about 6 people who took the time. He chuckled. If it helps, I left a 5-star review. That's quite the commitment to research, Carl. He gave a shrug. It's interesting. I've always been interested in history, just only when there's a really good mystery. Such as how hunter-gatherers with no knowledge of technology were able to construct something of this scale given the technology to achieve it didn't yet exist. Carl had been looking for something on the pillar, proof that he had indeed done his homework, and he found it, turning to me in triumph. Mystery solved. I gave an exaggerated sigh. Aliens, the key to all archaeological mysteries. Actually, they left a few notes here saying this was a practice run for the pyramids. I didn't think it was important enough to put in the book, though. Carl snorted, and I moved to stand closer, looking at the odd drawing, which in fairness to the modern mind did rather closely resemble a classic UFO, with a round body and small people emerging from the chassis. It could be a flower, he allowed, although he didn't sound convinced. Like a depiction of Mother Nature, perhaps. We emerge from the womb of nature and live in symbiosis with it. It wasn't anything new. At this point, I'd heard all the theories. I'd even come up with a few myself. But I allowed Carl his musings. After all, it was the same reason I was here, dedicating my life to the project. I let my mind wander, spiralling down through the layers that stood between me and the base of the pillars. Would I even live long enough to dig that far? It wasn't as though I were a young man anymore. Part of me cursed the decades I'd wasted back in England, time that could have been spent scraping the earth away from the heart of the secrets here. Do you see how they stand close to the wolves? What's that now? Carl had stepped over to the next pillar, and my mind had wandered. I followed him, and peered at where he pointed. Oh, yes, they come out of the spaceship and turn into werewolves. He looked disappointed. Oh, I thought I'd got you there. Actually, that was the first carving that was exposed. The locals were the ones to find it years ago. See how the top of this pillar is more weathered than the rest? If I had a pound for every legend here about shapeshifters and lichens. They actually call it Wolf Hill in the local dialect. There's a tenuous link to some ancient writings that describe a pre-Islamic cult worshipping some sort of monster god that terrorised the land here. There's nothing to back it up, though. Carl traced a finger down the pillar, following a vertical line to a space below. Surely this is describing an underground chamber. This is some sort of air vent, and then... could that be under the pillar? We've not found anything like that with the radar. Still... I sighed. All I expect to find at the bottom of the pillars is the bottom of the pillars. But that does look like an underground chamber, no? I allowed that it did. There's nothing to tie it to this specific location. Carl looked crestfallen and stepped backwards. Shame. I laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. You aren't the first to be disappointed. Who knows? Maybe we'll uncover a UFO. You give me a ring if you do. We shared a conspiratorial grin. The sound of a car door slamming wiped my good mood as surely as if someone had tossed a bucket of icy water over me. Automatically, I turned in the direction of the steps leading down from the dig site and let out a long, low groan. Friends of yours? More like, the reason that I'm poor. I began walking between the trenches, heading for the steps, but before I got halfway, a heavily mustachioed man in a clean-pressed uniform, flanked by a couple of sweaty youths with rifles slung over their shoulders, materialised. I raised a hand in acknowledgement and hurried my pace, sliding my sunglasses down over my face. Professor. Colonel. We shook hands, his enormous paw crushing my fingers. That was the first reason I kept my sunglasses on when speaking with Colonel Toprak. If he'd seen my flinch of pain, that would be a point in his favour. The weather is wonderful today, no? He beamed at me as ever, showing his tar-stained teeth, and as if by clockwork, removed a cigarette and screwed it between his teeth. Gonna tempt you? No, thank you. Turkish tobacco is the best in the world, you know. So I've heard, Colonel. He blew smoke out with relish and leaned around me to look at the dig site. It has come to my attention, Professor, that you have guests from the press today. Nonsense, of course, because I'd submitted the relevant paperwork to his department 3 weeks ago, but the delicate balance of appeasement, without totally capitulating, had to be struck. I gave a non-committal shrug, waiting for him to make his demands. This lady, she is very beautiful, is she not? I looked at the reporter, who was practically cooing over Chad in his big, sweaty arms. Perhaps I can meet her. She will want to interview me. Toprak grinned, both of us knowing that the last thing this quasi-soldier wanted was public attention. Officially, Toprak was in charge of law enforcement in this area, and his remit covered a vast swath of the country. Although technically not a soldier, the difference was almost impossible to discern, and in the end, it was the army who held sway in this part of eastern Anatolia, rather than the government back in Ankara. Of course, Toprak and I never actually exchanged money in order to allow me to continue my work. The man might be corrupt, but he wasn't an idiot. But the passage of information between the dig site and the real world back home was tightly controlled by the authorities here, who were personified by Toprak. I had long since learned that he was a necessary evil, and the two of us had struck an uncomfortable balance that allowed me to continue working, whilst not entirely ceding my integrity. She's already run her interview. Now they're just recording some passive footage to overlay the discussion. I can't say it will make much of a splash back home. One of my few joys when speaking to this man was to overlay English idioms at every opportunity, which pushed Toprak's buttons ever so slightly. Of course, I never wanted to actually irritate the man, but it paid to pace my own patience with him. A splash? Toprak was no idiot, and he was clever enough to ignore the words, dragging on his smoke and leaning around me again. Have you found anything that I need to know about today, Professor? Nothing significant. No. He gave an enormous grin. Still, we should like to see your finds. I sighed. There was no way to prevent him entering the site, but I'd hoped to keep him at arm's length. When he'd used we in that way, it meant he'd been ordered by whoever's arse he was kissing to inspect our work, and probably to get an impression of the news team. I stood back and gestured for him to come down the steps, and he did so magnanimously, ordering one of his two goons to remain at the top. As I followed the two Turks down into the pit, I saw the young lad doff his helmet and spark up a smoke of his own, clearly glad to be out of his superior's line of sight for a minute. Toprak called greetings to my staff, the mixture of student volunteers and paid locals who willingly gave up their youth to scratch the dirt in search of history. All stopped what they were doing, watching the man nervously. Toprak, aware of the effect he was having, smiled beatifically. He strode towards the stark blonde hair of the reporter and paused, beaming at her before half glancing towards me. Colonel Toprak, Kathy Hoskins. Kathy, Colonel Toprak. Toprak seized her hand and bent to press it to his lips, which was helpful because he missed Kathy's wince at the intrusion. Kathy, I have watched your work many times. You are quite a celebrity here in my country. Absolute tosh, of course. He'd never heard of her when I told him about the segment 3 weeks ago. I knew he'd have feverishly researched her in the intervening period. It was his job, after all. It's a pleasure, Colonel. Of course, he beamed at her. I noticed his cigarette had vanished. You wouldn't wish to leave without the opportunity to speak with me, I'm sure. I am one of the most foremost experts on this site. As much rubbish as before, but I suddenly realised that Toprak was swinging an axe, metaphorically, of course. I could have predicted him coming to speak to her now, but his timing suddenly seemed too accurate. Well, we're on a tight schedule. Kathy threw a helpless look towards me, but I was powerless. Toprak knew it too, because he widened his smile, fishing for another cigarette. While I understand I am not perhaps as glamorous as yourself, however, I must insist that I check you and the professor covered a certain important subject during your interview. I saw the axe, blade sharpened to a razor's edge and swinging inexorably towards my neck. I see you have examined these pillars. Toprak saw nothing of the sort, but he never let a small thing like the truth invade his posturing. Effortlessly elbowing Chad out of the way, he strode the short distance to where Carl was stood uncertainly by the pillar we'd been discussing. Kathy motioned for Carl and the cameraman, whose name I thought was Ben, to start filming, but Toprak stood deliberately with his back to them, blocking any shot. Of course, Professor, you surely discussed the Arund figures. Arund. I tried not to sound too disgusted at this bastardization of the local dialect. It was a made-up word, taking Arund, the local word for a short-horned goat, and twisting it to sound like their word for a pre-Islamic deity, a sort of countryside legend about a devil-type creature, an opposite to God. Arund had been picked up by the officials who'd first been to the site, exclusively because it heightened the mystery. It was a smart move, designed to draw international attention, and in the process, international money. More than 2/3 of the funds generated to fuel the work we did here ended up being siphoned off into the military and government coffers, all passing efficiently through the sweaty palms of Colonel Toprak. A shrewd idea, marvellous in its simplicity, it allowed Toprak to buy the Rolex he sported on his left wrist, and allowed me to keep digging. The problem was, it was complete bollocks. More than that, it was an insult to my profession. Kathy stabbed me in the back by tailing off, revealing that she knew nothing whatsoever of the stupid figures, most likely carved by some Stone Age teenager who'd been chewing psychedelic mushrooms. His name had probably been Chad. No, perhaps it slipped his mind. Toprak turned and gave me a calculated grin, and in that moment, I felt the axe blow land, severing any agency that I'd had until that point. I sighed. There was little point in arguing. Where are the figures? Kathy was peering at them nervously, as though expecting them to jump out at her. See? They clearly depict some reference to ancient high technology. They didn't. In fact, they pointed only to someone's overactive imagination, and too many werewolf stories told around a campfire, but Kathy was nodding along, as though Toprak was speaking chapter and verse. And here, the greatest mystery of all, a hidden underground chamber, right here beneath this pillar. I swore under my breath and caught Carl's raised eyebrow. I shrugged, as though to indicate how helpless I was, and he gave a sympathetic twist of the lips. There's no evidence from the ground-penetrating radar scans, I began, but Toprak was well prepared. Of course, we see plenty of sites around the world, indeed, here in Anatolia, where such scientific methods reach their limits. Is that not true, Professor? Kathy turned to me, expectantly. Yes, there are some types of rock that bar the penetration of the scans, but to claim that such a chamber exists here is only speculation. Toprak as always chose to play the great charmer. The Professor, oh how my friend and I love to debate our methods. He wishes only to scrape away the dust here, uncovering what? Pots and scraps of history, my friend? He knew very well that we'd uncovered the square root of sod all from our trenches. The site was 12,000 years old, and any pots or other everyday goods would long since have decayed. Toprak knew that, but good God, the man could act when needed. And yet the truest secret lies hidden beneath our feet. What is in this chamber, Kathy? Can your viewers tell? She smiled back, in her element chasing a story. Professor, why haven't you excavated the chamber? I mumbled an answer about the process of methodical site clearance, digging through every layer in painstaking order so as not to damage anything hidden there. But she had the impatience of youth. Surely, Professor, it would be better for you and your colleagues to put this question to rest immediately. I tried to murder Toprak with my eyes, but he only lit another cigarette and pulled his sunglasses down over his eyes. Job done. His soldier, a bored-looking sergeant, shifted as though to move. The decision had been made for me. Are you sure you won't try some Turkish tobacco, Professor? For once, I indulged the man and inhaled deeply, feeling the sharp tang fill my lungs. A bead of sweat ran down my back, and I shuffled into the shade. Look happy, my friend, Toprak clapped me on the back. You are an archaeologist. This is what you want to do. I supposed he was right. Digging holes was what I did for a living. It was just that there was a way to do this, and this wasn't it. Chad! I called the lumbering oaf over and frowned when he smiled at Kathy. Stop drooling and get the ore sampler brought down. Are we stopping work on the trenches? For now. But just do it, I snapped. Please, I added in a conciliatory tone of voice, remembering that I had to live with these people, day in, day out. There was no point in falling out now. Voices rose as Toprak made his excuses and left, his overbearing presence replaced soon with the rumble of a tracked vehicle. I repurposed ice core driller. We'd found that the delicate strata of the geology here could collapse under the weight of a conventional drill, and so someone who'd studied a more useful degree than me had built this roaring monstrosity, controlled of all things by a remote control. Bloody technology, I snarled, toking the last of the cigarette and flicking the butt onto the baking hot ground. Fortunately, no one heard me, because Chad was stealing the show, driving the thing down the ramp and past the trenches. More than a few admiring looks followed him, and Kathy was practically dribbling by the time Chad and his enormous machine arrived at the pillar. There followed a tedious period where I was forced to calibrate the machine and set it up, being the only one on site who was trained to do so. I did it with bad grace, aware that I was going against my better judgment, and doing my best not to think of all the layers of artefacts we might destroy. "Come on, Professor." Alice, one of my friendlier student volunteers, tried to cheer me up with a cup of tea. "At least this way we'll shut them all up, and we can go back to digging the trenches. It won't take long, will it?" I glanced at my watch, seeing the day had flown by. "We can start, but we'll not make much progress by nightfall." "Nightfall?" Kathy had overheard. "Our flight leaves in the morning. We've got a hotel back in..." She had forgotten the name of the nearest city. "Or an Earther," I reminded her. "Well, you're the boss." Unfortunately, she didn't decide to leave, instead giving way with bad grace. "Have you got anywhere for us to sleep?" I was even more annoyed when I discovered that I was a gentleman, and so offered her my own tent, a grand affair that wouldn't have gone out of place in Glastonbury. As the coring machine set to buzzing away, I managed to turf one of the younger volunteers out of his own camp bed in favour of sleeping under the stars, and took myself and a bottle of 10-year-old Talisker outside. A scorpion scuttled past my foot, and I squashed it instinctively. "Sorry, old chap," I apologised to the grey smear. "I'm a little on edge tonight." I nearly dropped the bottle when Kathy spoke from the lengthening dust shadows. "First sign of madness." I managed to recover myself. "Yes, and the second sign is hiding in the darkness." "I thought it was digging holes in the desert." She held out a hand, and I handed the bottle over, watching as she took a pull and barely flinched. "Not your first scotch." "I was born in Glasgow, grew up all around Scotland." "But went to a good school?" She smiled. "Alice told me to ask you about the legend." She frowned, sitting down on a prominent boulder. "Actually, she specifically asked me not to tell you she said that, which makes me think I should really ask you." I sat down and took the bottle back, letting the amber spirit kick me in the tonsils. "I'm a scientist. I don't care for legends." "Well, I'm a reporter and I do. Besides, I'm your guest. Entertain me." She was smiling as she said it. I wondered where this charming and witty personality had been earlier when she'd been dragging her heels through the interview. Or maybe she was just drunk. "It's not very long. The farmers around here tell legends of the tomb of some ancient evil that was imprisoned in the land. There are 12 deities. It's hard to translate because the word doesn't go fully into English, but it's like the opposite of a god." "The devil, surely?" "No, not necessarily demonic." I had to stop at that and think hard about the sentence that had just come out of my mouth. Some scientist, I was. "They're sort of morally ambiguous, and depending on which version of the story you ask, there was a great struggle, or a battle, or a cataclysm of some kind. They were either imprisoned underground, or they chose to hibernate." She was wide-eyed. "Wow, you're really shit at telling stories, you know that?" "Yes, that's why I dig holes in the desert." She snorted and took another pull on the scotch, then surprised me by producing a pack of fags. "Want one?" "I thought your generation were all into vaping." "Vapes are for wimps. Besides, these are Turkish. Put hairs on your chest and all that." I decided Kathy was all right, and we settled into a companionable silence for a few minutes, passing the bottle back and forth as the moon rose. Eventually she broke the silence. "Surely you can't just ignore the fact that there's a story about demons trapped underground and you're, digging downwards?" I turned on the professoriority. "Actually, almost every ancient site in the world has deep local knowledge and legends surrounding it, even if it was mostly hidden like this one. It's completely plausible that they have stories about the place, only without any full detail on what happened here." "That's like campfire legends being passed down over generations?" "Exactly. Over time, the story becomes twisted and people lose sight of the actual mystery." "Which is?" I gestured around. "How hunter-gatherers 12,000 years ago managed to build something that they didn't have the technology nor the knowledge to construct. It's impossible. But it's here." I nodded, and that's the mystery. Maybe they built it to imprison demons. I sighed as Kathy dissolved into helpless giggles. "If that's so, you can say I told you so." She stayed a few minutes longer before returning to her tent, my tent. At some point, I realised I was totally pissed because the bottle was mostly empty and there were giggles coming from the tent, signalling that Chad had made his move. I'm not that kind of professor, so I made myself scarce, leaving the youths to frolic as the machine dug inch by inch into the ground. I slept appallingly badly, waking to dreams of masked figures chasing me down long hallways. Bloody Scotch, bloody Kathy, bloody Toprak. On top of it all, the smoking had given me a cough. Stupid world. A bloody great hole in the ground. The Cora had reached almost as far as it was capable of travelling. The one small victory I knew I would have was that despite Toprak's urging, we were never going to be able to get a human down there. For starters, it wasn't safe. Underground cavern or no, I wouldn't risk anyone down there without a full and detailed survey from a professional caver, and then someone younger and more suicidal could take the leap. No. The best we could do was put a camera down there, and I cursed as I stared at a stack of olive green protective cases that I knew held the bloody examination device somewhere. I just couldn't remember which. Morning. Alice brought me a cup of tea. Sleep well? No need to shout, I grumbled, my raspy voice giving away the near-fatal headache that was pounding through my skull. Oh dear, that bad? I had to take a moment to fight a wave of nausea. Desperately, I sipped the tea, hoping I might choke and die there and then. My spirits were only lifted when Kathy ducked into the supply tent, eyes wide and hair in disarray. Whiskey. Why whiskey? I actually retched at that and made a hasty exit, followed a moment later by Alice, who had retrieved the camera without any seeming difficulty. Morning! Chad strode over with 2 coffees and handed one to Kathy, who took it and stared at it. I hoped for the sake of Chad's ego she remembered the previous night. She hadn't drunk that much whiskey, but then again, she was a pocket-sized lady. Have you checked the Cora? For some reason I wanted to wipe the smile off his face, but the bloody wanker just nodded. Yeah, almost at its limit. I already knew that, but now I was just stuck in a grump loop, as my mother would have called it. I didn't have the energy to mutter under my breath as I strode over to the Cora, seeing the stupid machine hammering away at the stupid ground. I winced and hid the pain in my cup of tea. Switch it off! What? Off! I made a slicing motion across my throat, and Chad spilled his coffee as he hurried over to flip the switch. That made me smile. Al, Chad called to Alice, and she hurried over with the camera, cracking open the case as the Cora began to retract telescopically. Why? Kathy had to pause and close her eyes. Why stop it now? I shrugged, then winced. I've got a feeling. What feeling? Headache. She tried to laugh, but that was too painful. Carl and Ben made their way over, camera equipment at the ready. They nodded a greeting, looking a little worse for wear themselves. I wondered how many beers they'd managed to secrete in their hire car. Battery is full, Alice called over her shoulder. I grunted in response, glad the infernal machine had finally stopped making its racket. How does the camera work? I stared at Kathy. In her defence, she looked surprised that the words had even come out of her mouth. I'm just trying to... She clapped a hand over her mouth and shook her head, suddenly very pale. Alice was looking at me expectantly, and the Cora had finished withdrawing from the hole, so I crossed to stand by the pillar, glancing just once at the ring of figures that stood next to the wolf. I recalled the vivid nightmares I'd suffered, and just for a moment, felt a thrill of fear. Bloody hell. Professor? Alice was uncertain, and I shook my head at her. Get the monitor set up, would you? I'll stand here and pay the cable out. That way, if I cock it up, it's my fault. She nodded and scurried away. Already a crowd of my students was forming, none of whom were usually out of bed before 8 in the morning. Most were bleary-eyed, and I made a mental note to check the levels of alcohol being concealed around the camp. Mostly because I was now completely out. I checked the camera, seeing the red LED, and then knelt to examine the roll of heavy-duty cable. A wave of nausea rushed to the top of my head, and I almost fell over. Professor, should I get you some water? Alice was hovering concernedly. I'm just hungover, Alice. It's worse at my age. She smiled sympathetically. This won't take many minutes, then you can probably go back to bed for the rest of the day. I felt a sudden rush of affection for my student, and fought the urge to hug her. The sudden emotion made me realise my irrational fear earlier had been just the booze speaking. Christ, but what a day to be doing this. All right, monitor on. Alice tapped a few keys. Kerry, one of the other students, came over, and the two of them made some adjustments. Oh, I can see you. I was aiming the camera up my nose, and hastily turned it towards the tube that the Cora had left in place. I spared a moment to peer down, seeing nothing past a few feet. Ready? Alice gave a thumbs up. I was aware that Ben was filming me already, and Carl sidled over. Don't get my face, will you? He smirked. Actually, I was going to say, can you give Kathy a rundown of what you're doing, but seeing as how neither of you are camera fit this morning, do you mind narrating a voiceover later? I grunted and agreed. He retreated a safe distance. See anything? I called to Alice. Pipe, she called back helpfully. Somewhere, I caught the whiff of frying meat. One good thing about the Turks was their food, and I hadn't had a bad meal since I got here. My stomach gave a lurch at the thought of honey and yoghurt and some bacon. The ground was suddenly a yawning darkness with a cloud of dust rising into my eyes. Instinctively, I dropped the cable and raised my hands to protect my vision, but at the same time felt myself falling forwards. There was no time to yell. I expected to hit the bottom of the pit, but instead I was falling, and then I impacted something hard, and fear was tearing through me because I was out of control, bumping, rebounding, now off hard surfaces, all the wind knocked out of me and pain lancing through every fibre of my being. My vision was black with dust, my throat was choked with it, I couldn't scream, couldn't see, and although my hands scrabbled instinctively, I couldn't find a solid purchase. Wham! I slammed into the floor. I felt something pop in my hip. Instant numbness seized my right leg, and I tried to curse, instead lapsing into a fit of coughing. I poured desperately my eyes, needing to get a bearing. Wet earth coated my face, and that made it easier to clear the dust. A chink of light showed, then more, and suddenly I could see through, although it was only a single ray of sunlight that stretched to the bottom, and all it revealed was crumbling mud and rock, still moving. I tried to wriggle, my numb leg instantly sending shooting pains up my back. Had I broken something there? A fear of being paralysed suddenly took hold of me, and I frantically struggled, only to feel my legs flapping. I turned, seeing a mass of sliding earth moving away from where my feet were still kicking, and I froze, suddenly aware that I'd fallen into a sinkhole, and the fact that I wasn't buried alive was a miracle. Everywhere I looked there was movement. The walls were shedding themselves every few seconds, the earth I was laying on seemed to be sliding away down a crevice. I tried to think, to see what the best thing to do was. Professor! The voice came from a long way above. How far had I fallen? No, surely that was simply the distortion from being down in the hole. The sinkhole couldn't be more than a few metres deep. Chad and the others would toss down a rope to me any second now and tug me out. Except with the shout came a flurry of falling debris, which struck me in the face, and I suddenly found myself on my feet, numb leg be damned, because the entire side of the pit was caving in, and I threw myself at the opposite wall, tasting wet earth as tons of material fell exactly where I'd been laying. I slid suddenly, looking down, and saw bare rock exposed, a yawning hole confusing my mind for a moment, until I remembered the geology here was filled with natural holes, like a giant Swiss cheese. That was why we'd opted for the Cora in the first place. The machine must have disturbed an underground cavern, and the earth had shifted. I'd just had the misfortune to be standing over it when it decided to move. "I'm all right!" I yelled back up, and thought I heard a shouted response, but even as I spoke, more earth fell and struck me in the face. I spat and clawed at my eyes again. Clearly, I only had seconds left before the bloody thing came down on me. I took a step, and my foot slipped, this time going down the gap in the rock, and I hastily withdrew it, seeing a slip of earth fall down there. A creaking sound. I looked up in time to see the light at the top being blotted out by falling debris. There was no time to think. I moved my other foot and flung myself bodily into the hole in the rock. I screamed as I fell, feet out in front of me like some bastardised version of a child's slide. As gravity took me, I realised the rock here was smooth, clearly worn by the passage of water, and as earth struck me in the back of the head, I slid naturally, spurred on by frantic movements from my hands, as I tried to race the smothering impacts of the crashing weight falling behind me. Instantly, all light was cut off, and it was pitch black. I could hear nothing but the wet noise and thump of the earth falling in, burying me alive in this pit. I swore, then instantly flinched at the sound of my own voice. I had to keep moving, and I slid on my bum like a moron, striking my head at times on the rock above me. I felt liquid, and that was a good sign. So long as they could dig me out, I could stay alive, sipping the moisture that leaked into the ground. Then again, who knew how much oxygen there was in here? Maybe I'd be dead in the next few minutes. Wham! I fell again, this time plummeting only a few feet and landing right on my arse. It jarred my entire body, and I heard a weird keening cry come from somewhere, suddenly realising it was me. I clamped my jaw shut, cutting the noise out, and instantly heard nothing but the pounding of my own heartbeat. It was pitch black, no ambient light at all. I waved a hand in front of my own face, utterly unable to see it. I turned, feeling around me in the gloom. There was nothing. The surface I had landed on seemed to be relatively flat, made again of smooth rock, which told me there was water here too. I wondered how far underground I was. Christ, but if only there was some light. I began to try and stand, my left leg horribly senseless. I tentatively reached out above me, careful not to smack my head on more rocks, and found that if I stretched, I could pretty much reach the ceiling. That was helpful. It helped me to balance as I turned around and tried to pick a direction in which to go. I turned back to find the hole I'd fallen through and realised I had no idea which way that was. Shit! My voice echoed, telling me the cavern I stood in was huge. That was good in terms of my available oxygen. It was less good for navigation. I began to try and walk in the direction I was facing, counting my steps, but stumbled a few times and soon gave up on the whole idea. Plus, my arms got tired quickly. I decided to keep one in front of my face instead, warding off any blows from the walls of my prison. Christ, but was that light up ahead? My steps became feverish. I tripped and sprawled more than once and staggered straight back up. The cavern roof lowered as I drew closer, and I dropped to my hands and knees, heedless of the tearing I felt on my skin. I didn't care about anything in that moment except reclaiming my ability to see, to visualise the world around me, and that was all that mattered. A thump, and I found myself sprawling on my front. That stopped me for a moment as more lights appeared, these in the form of stars swimming around me. I lay still and panted for a minute, suddenly remembering the hangover. The moment I thought it, I realised my mouth was parched, and it seemed oddly warm in the chamber. I frowned. Had I stumbled onto an underground lava flow? That seemed literally impossible, given the fact that we were nowhere near an active fault line. Still, it seemed in that moment that anything was possible, and I crawled onwards. The light was purple. Well, that was weird, but I was in no position to be picky. I kept going, wondering what my team on the surface would be doing. Aside from the corer, they had absolutely no equipment to help dig me out of here, and it might be days before anything heavy enough to begin the process could be brought in. I tried to push those thoughts from my mind, because the light was closer now, only a few metres ahead, and I could see that it was visible through a narrow crack in the wall. No! The crack was too small. I roared my fury as I reached it, seeing that there was no hope of me slipping through it. I slammed my fist against the wall, and in doing so slipped and struck my mouth on the floor. Dazed, I rolled over onto my back and cursed, tasting metal. Metal? Obviously I was bleeding, but this was stronger than that. I pushed myself back onto my belly and stared at the rock, but there wasn't enough light to see by. I frowned, knocking it with a knuckle, but rock was rock, was rock. I scratched it, testing the hardness, but you needed to be able to see to do that test properly. I licked it. Metal. Metallic rock. Was this an ore vein? I tried to recall if anyone had ever mentioned tasting rocks to me. Obviously geology was a part of my expertise, but only in the context of digging underground. I couldn't tell one rock type from another in these conditions, but the taste. Maybe that explained why our radar hadn't seen this. A great underground complex of caves and... caves filled with purple light. A mysterious underground cavern. A shiver ran down my spine. There was no way. I was a scientist, for goodness sake. Demons and fairy tales belonged in mythology. It was nonsense, all of it. No, there was some luminous fungi up ahead, and like it or lump it, I had to get through that crack. I swallowed my fear and approached it again, seeing that it was narrow and tall, like the eye of a cat. That was good. It meant the rock at the apexes might be thinner, and I could chip it off. I pressed my head against it experimentally, seeing if perhaps I'd been wrong and I could squeeze through. Nope. I backed off and took a grip of the left-hand side, feeling to my joy that the rock here was thin enough to wrap my hand around. Indeed, it came to a razor's edge, almost like a sharpened blade, and I had to take care not to cut my hand. Come on, you bastard! I slammed my palm against the thinnest part I could see, and received only more pain for my efforts. I groaned, gritted my teeth, and tried again. Thump, thump, thump. And then, miracle of miracles, a tiny chunk of rock smashed away from the main part, and suddenly the space in front of me wasn't tiny anymore. I lay grinning and panting. If I could do it once, I could do it again. It was just a matter of perseverance. Maybe I could eat some of the glowing fungi. There was water in the tunnel behind me. I'd survive, so long as they managed to find me. Thump, thump, thump. It felt like I was there for days. My head was pounding and I was covered in sweat. I knew I was bleeding, and that was bad. An infection down here would finish me as surely as suffocation. But there was nothing to be done. Thump, thump, thump. I shoved my head back into the hole, and it passed through, albeit nearly severing my left ear in the process. I pulled myself back. Just a little more. Thump, thump, crash! An entire section of the rock in front of me fell away, and I froze, suddenly aware of the great weight of the earth above me. I half expected a cave-in, and it all to come crashing down, but for now, I was safe, and I threw myself forward with abandon, tumbling into another cave, this one suffused with a purple light. From the far end. It was long and roughly rectangular in shape. The light wasn't bright, but it was so dark down here that the effect was spread over a vast distance. I wondered briefly whether the fungi was radioactive or something. That would be a cruel trick to play on me. Survive this, only to die from a stomach tumour in 10 years' time. Still, right now another 10 years seemed a good trade to make, and I pressed on, finally able to stand up straight. I heard trickling water and turned to see a wet side of rock next to me. Greedily, I pressed my lips to the wall, sucking like a madman for what could have been hours until my mouth felt less like sandpaper. I took a moment to rest my head against the coolness, feeling the wonderful sensation of it running over my forehead, wetting my receding hairline. That reminded me that I wasn't a young man anymore. My body was not made for this sort of adventuring. The sooner I was out, the better. I started and peered closer at the wall. Had the water worn those patterns? I recalled some argument about the Sphinx at Giza, someone making the case that the erosion patterns on the stone don't match the current historical timeline for that particular location. I hadn't waded into the argument, but I'd briefly gone down a rabbit hole of water erosion, and I tried to recall what they'd said. These looked like polyps, which I thought meant vertical erosion, and that tied in with what I was seeing, but those lines there were too uniform and straight. I staggered back, clapping a filthy hand to my mouth. My heart was pounding again, and all thoughts of personal safety vanished, because what I was looking at was the find of the century, of the millennium. Forget what was on the pillars above. I knew hieroglyphs when I saw them. I cursed myself, suddenly remembering a term at university when a professor had offered to teach me to read ancient Egyptian, but I'd met a girl and spent every spare moment with her instead. But these didn't look like the Rosetta Stone. Instead, these were far simpler, displaying animal motifs for the most part, although here and there were groups of humans depicted alongside the animals. Or the water had worn them away hugely. I cursed the same liquid that was prolonging my life and shook my head, unable to make it out. Bloody Toprak was right. The tosspot. But at the same time, I realised that if someone had built this chamber 12,000 years ago, then they had to have built a way in and a way out, which meant all I had to do was find it, and not die in the process. I turned towards the purple light at the far end of the chamber and began walking, wary of lumps of rock ahead of me. I couldn't fully discount the risk of a cave-in, given my destructive work back at the crack in the wall. I hurried on, feeling my stomach rumble, and remembered I hadn't eaten at all that day. I didn't think the glowing mushrooms would taste nice, but, well, needs must and all that. I heard more water and turned to mark the source. I had no idea how long I was going to be down here, and it would be prudent to mark them all. There were more carvings here, and as I walked, I realised the entire chamber was covered in them. I peered closer, wishing I had an electric light. It was all groups of men? They had oddly shaped faces, and I thought briefly of how Carl would gloat about aliens. I thrust such nonsense from my mind and peered. Those were surely the men, working with animals, and these were different, standing taller by a head, still human-shaped, but their faces were totally dark. Well, that wasn't creepy. I was steps away from the mushrooms when I realised they weren't mushrooms at all. They were statues, and the glowing purple light was their eyes. Oh! I staggered backwards, horror overcoming me because the statues were so realistic. Each was sat on a throne-like chair, and they were in a circle, facing inwards, which explained the weird diffusion of light. I felt my bowels turn to water, and my heart suddenly went into palpitations. My breathing was rushed and erratic, and I felt a pain in my chest. Was I about to be frightened to death? I must have stayed there, utterly frozen in fear, unable to turn my back, incapable of moving forwards. Surely my fright was heightened by the stress of the situation I found myself in, but even realising that didn't help to lessen the impact. I tried to force myself to breathe, slow the frantic beating in my heart, and slowly, beat by beat, I fought back my control. My chest pulsed, the left side just above the top rib. I winced and rubbed the spot, and that normal movement helped to bring me back. I realised that for the first time in my life, I had truly been frozen with fear. The shock of seeing another person down here, that was it. My brain had registered them as people because they were so lifelike. It was nothing more than that, coupled with the pressure of being buried alive. There was no danger. I was safe. More than that, I was the discoverer of the greatest archaeological find in history. Surely this outstripped anything the Egyptologists had uncovered. This pointed to an entirely new civilization, buried intentionally thousands of years before any humans were supposed to have left the wild plains of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle and settled in societies. More than that, the technology and skill required to build this was unfathomable. It spoke to generations of craftsmen, passing down knowledge from father to son to grandson over hundreds of years. It spoke of a secure society, able to explore the progressive skills of engineering and advanced construction. Maybe they'd even had universities. Maybe they'd even had archaeologists. A chill ran down my spine. Angrily, I shook my head. This was my site, my achievement, and in that moment I knew that even if I didn't live to reveal it to the world, I would be content that it had been me to discover this long-lost secret. I steeled my mind, told myself the statues belonged to me, and strode forward into the circle. Here the hieroglyphs were on the floor, each clearly labelling the statues in what must be a name. I counted 1, 2, 12 in total, all seated identically with their hands resting on their thighs. All stared straight forward with that odd luminescence forming the eyes of the statues. I frowned, realising that the legends of the buried demons were correct, just not in the supernatural sense. Someone, for some unknown reason, had buried these figures after going to extraordinary lengths to create them. The eyes were captivating. I couldn't work out the source of the light, which was a deep purple, magnificent to look at. I snapped myself away, having fallen almost into a trance, staring at a figure marked with a weapon of some sort. Clearly, this was a warrior, and I glanced back at the eyes, seeing for the first time the shape of the head. It was distorted because of a hood that covered all the way to just above the eyes, with a clever cut on both sides, that I guessed would allow the user to see from their peripherals. It was quite ornate. Clearly the original had been cut from a luxurious cloth, which once again spoke to the advancement of the society that made these. The face. That was what was bothering me, drawing me in. There was simply no face. Of course, that was a trick of the light. It was dim in here, and my own eyes wouldn't be able to discern the shadows that the purple luminescence created. But the effect was chilling, as I suspected the artisan had intended, because instead of skin, or even a dark cloth, the sight was one of absolutely nothing. Pure, unadulterated blackness that sucked in all light. It wasn't even accurate to describe it as black. It was more of an absence of all light, of anything. I turned my back on that one and examined another. Identical. I couldn't quite bring myself to touch them yet. I would build up to that. After all, there was nothing to do but wait down here in the dark. I had time. How had the purple light remained after all this time? What was it that the stonemason had planted there that would keep growing for 12,000 years? It was an impossibly long stretch of time. Too much for a human mind to comprehend. Nothing, not one single artifact that I knew of had survived that long. Then again, fungi were known to be extraordinarily poorly understood beings, far more closely related to humans than the average person might guess. It was, possibly, plausible that such a plant could live for that long. Perhaps the structure of the plant was larger than I realised. My imagination showed me a web of intricate passages for the fungi to grow inside the bodies of the statues, perhaps all connected as one being. Maybe that was the secret that these people had hidden. Maybe there was something radical here, a life form that was perhaps a fungi that was conscious? I was clutching at wild theories, but they sounded more plausible than aliens. I found myself nodding along to my own thoughts, stopping short of speaking out loud, but it made sense. I wondered if each of the statues represented a face of the fungi god, a different personality, a bit like a patron saint. That would explain why they were all identical. I began to examine glyphs on the floor in more detail. This one, clearly a sword. That was a warrior. This one, perhaps an infant. Patron saint of mothers, perhaps. This one, a wolf. I glossed over that. Another one, food. I shook my head, wishing I had something to write this all down on. I smiled ruefully at the thought, seeing in my mind's eye the thousands of pages I would have to write. I didn't need a notepad. I needed a library. One symbol caught my eye, repeated each time. That of a wolf stood next to a man, except it was a huge wolf, standing as tall as the man himself, who clutched a spear, denoting another warrior class. I frowned, annoyed by the implication of yet more superstition, but I knew dire wolves hadn't gone extinct that long ago, and it was plausible simply from the implied age of this civilization that it existed alongside megafauna like that. I clasped my hands to my head. This threw off the entire known human timeline. If humans had existed tens of thousands of years before we'd known there was such history that we'd lost. Advanced ancient technologies, understanding of our own beings, even things that could help us today. I wondered what had become of the artisan who'd laboured for so long to create these. Had he been murdered to hide their secret? It seemed implausible. Even 12 millennia on, people in the cave still knew what was here. That got me thinking of the metallic stone I'd crawled over to get here, and I frowned, realising that the figures were probably carved from the same material. That set me to wondering how we'd remove them from the chamber in order to hoist them into a museum, because there was no chance about that. They had to be sent to London to be displayed. We'd never let the Turks keep something like this. It was my find. They were my statues. I leaned close and peered at the ornate folds of the hood, seeing how tightly cut to the head it was. Again, there was that weird darkness between it and where the eyes began. I began to shiver, but steeled myself and extended a hand to test the metallic. I whipped my hand back as though burned because it wasn't stone. It was cloth. I was in the circle surrounded by them as I froze again, ice pouring in rivulets down my spine. I could see the fabric moving slightly where my foolish hands had touched it. My chest was pounding again, pain spreading through me, and I forced my breathing to be calm. It was just a cloth over a statue. The designer had built them to have this exact effect. That was all. I was safe. They were made of stone. They couldn't hurt me. I repeated the mantra over and over again until my breathing slowed, barely, and I was able to try to collect my thoughts, forcing them into a rational examination of what I saw. If there was cloth, that spoke volumes again to the material that it was made from. No natural fibre could last 12,000 years underground. Even plastic only lasted about 1,000, so this was some new material, new to us at least. This could surely revolutionise manufacturing. Christ, but I was going to be rich as well as famous. What a change for our world. Perhaps this would solve global warming, fix pollution, enable capitalism to function as a sustainable model without destroying our planet. Christ, what if they were aliens? Did it really matter what they were? Yes. And it was my job to find out. I had to start thinking about what to take with me when I was rescued. I turned and looked around the circle. Would the hood be attached to the rest of the body? What if the artist had clad the entire statue? There was no way that I'd be able to lift one of them out of the throne by myself. I'd have to cut the hood off, but how? I had no sharp implement, no pocket knife or even a trowel for digging in the earth. I glanced down at my hands, wondering if I was strong enough to simply rip this mystery immortal material, and there was blood on my hand. I stared at it in stupefaction until I remembered the razor-sharp edge of the crack I'd forced myself through. I took off at as rapid a pace as I could move in the dim light, forced to a chafingly slow pace until I reached a pile of rubble, and then a frantic rummage until I found something that was sharp and big enough to hold in my hand. Back up the tunnel, past the glyphs on the wall, into the circle. Which one? That one. Pick any of them. It doesn't... Holy Mother of God, that one's moved. I was suddenly holding the rock like a weapon, cradling it in my desperate hands because... Was it a trick of the light? That one's head was surely lifted a little. Maybe I hadn't noticed it before. No, that was impossible. I'd looked at them all, searching for any difference in the appearance. A trick, maybe. Some security mechanism I'd tripped so they moved and scared the bejesus out of whoever came exploring. I licked my lips, chest pounding and burning. Whatever was happening behind my sternum, it wasn't good. More movement, this time out of my peripherals. I turned, whipped fast, but the statue sat innocuously. I was on the edge now, the rock pressing into my palm. I realised that it was dripping blood from the wound I'd noticed earlier. Drip. 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 I was frozen, utterly frozen, like a kid hearing a noise in their bedroom. Had there been anything, I knew I'd have pulled it over my head and hidden. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, to get away, but my feet simply wouldn't obey me. I stood like that for what felt like hours. Nothing moved, but I knew that one had lifted its head. I moistened my lips, knowing that what I was about to do was ridiculously stupid, infantile in fact, but I'd already taken the breath, and... Hello? My voice rebounded from the walls, filling my ears. My chest throbbed. It was ridiculous. I felt a surge of adrenaline throw through me as nothing happened. Only my own voice sounding in my ears, and I began to chastise myself for my stupidity, and, as one, their heads snapped up to stare at me. There were not words in human language to describe what went through me. I felt my legs give way as my heart pounded out of my chest. I fell backwards as the hooded figures rose to their feet and surrounded me, moving on cat-like steps. human. I was dying. Their voices were in my head, naming me for what I was. I tried to speak, to scream, but nothing came out. I could feel darkness sweeping over me as they closed in. And then, as my final few breaths circulated my lungs, they moved as one again, raising their hands and pulling back their hoods, revealing what lay beneath. And that was when I died. Death. It's an odd feeling knowing that you've died. Of course, I came to in the glaring sunlight, being given frantic CPR by my students. But they assured me that it had been at least 5 minutes since they'd found me, at the mouth of a narrow cave that no one had noticed before. That's their story anyway. I saw the shadow that passed over their faces when they told me that lie they'd all concocted. How many of them had found me? I suspected it was only Alice and Chad. Kathy and her team would have spilled the beans immediately. What, did the creatures hand me over to the 2 students, terrifying them into silence? Yes. I imagined that they carried me out of that place as my body failed me, laying me down and summoning those 2 through whatever means they'd used to speak inside my head. And they'd vanished back underground, leaving me with a story that no one believed, and one word lingering in my head. Cotus. Whatever that means. I have no idea. I simply don't have the knowledge, but I know now there is something down there. Something that has the means to get back to the surface, but chooses not to. And that tells me only one thing. They built that place, and they shut themselves away. I don't care about living to an old age anymore. The mystery has me, as they say, by the balls. I'm a laughingstock in the scientific community now. That's fine. I'll find a way to get back there, to enter that cave, even if I have to blast that bloody desert open with an atomic bomb. Because someone has to show the world to those creatures. Someone has to bring them out, and show them what has grown in the time that they've been away. Someone has to bring the gods back to Earth. Hello and thank you very much for watching. If you did enjoy the story, then please click the like button and subscribe to my channel for more stories. For my novels, follow the link in the description box below to my Amazon page. You can follow me on both Instagram and Substack @Toby_author for both. My name is Toby and I write stories.